Good morning. My name is Rayyan El Amin. I'm the Assistant Director here at the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs. I'd like to welcome you to this one-day workshop on the effects of the Syrian crisis on neighboring countries. I'm welcoming you on the behalf of our director, Dr. Tariq Mitri, who unfortunately couldn't be here today because he is traveling. I hope, now we have sound. Okay, very good. So thanks for coming. And we have two main programs here at Issam Fares Institute that deal with the Syrian crisis. One is the International Affairs program that deals mostly with the geopolitics and the political aspects of the crisis. And then we have another program, the Refugee Research and Policy program, that deals mostly with the refugee issues. And I'd like to thank the coordinators for both of those programs, Yara Murad and Rudaina Balbaki, for helping organize this. But all I'm going to do is pretty much also hand it over to our partners in this workshop today and thank them also for organizing and supporting this workshop. The first is the Center for Middle Eastern Strategic Studies in Turkey and ORSAM, and who have been institutional partners with us now for a while, and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, which has supported the Institute for a while also. So I'd like to thank both of the institutions and pretty much hand it over to Mr. Peter Rimmel and Dr. Shaban to talk a little bit about what we hope to accomplish today. So thank you.
Thank you, dear Ryan, dear Professor Kardash, fellow colleagues from Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon. And a warm welcome to everybody. Merhaba, hoş geldiniz. Let me first take the opportunity to thank the Issam Fares Institute for hosting us here today. It's always a great pleasure and a stimulating experience to attend workshops at the Issam Fares Institute and to discuss the most pressing issues that we are facing today in this region. Our topic today definitely belongs to those issues. Secondly, let me thank Professor Kardash for being here with us today. We at the Adenauer Foundation are very proud to call the ORSAM Institute our partner and to regularly conduct projects together. I'm glad that we will further continue our cooperation in the future, and of course, this is true for the Issam Fares Institute as well. Ladies and gentlemen, it was more than 6 years ago that the Arab Spring came to Syria. I believe that none of us had imagined at that time what we are witnessing now. The civil war in Syria is one of the greatest humanitarian tragedies of our time. Of the 23 million Syrians, it is assumed that more than 300,000 have been killed. Almost 5 million Syrians have fled the country. Around 7 million have been internally displaced. So many tragedies. And unfortunately, we are nowhere near a solution for Syria. And what I mean is a political solution. The fighting between the Assad regime, the rebels, and all the other armed groups and even other armies persists. The Islamic State and other parties continue to commit atrocities in the northern and eastern Syria. We are slowly facing the sad reality that the conflict in Syria might not be solved within the next month, years, or maybe even decades. With the conflict looming over Syria and the realization that many Syrian refugees will not be able to return to their homes in the foreseeable future, we need to think about the situation in the host countries in the region. How can we accommodate the large numbers of refugees in the host countries? How can we prevent future conflicts between the host societies and the refugee population? What can we do to ensure a positive development in the neighboring countries that will lessen the humanitarian catastrophe and will provide a better future for all? In order to answer these questions, we need to understand the specific effects of the Syrian crisis on the neighboring countries. Only if we fully comprehend what challenges the situation in Syria and the refugee flows have brought to these countries, can we think of solutions and how to overcome these challenges. For this, we need thorough research. Of course, there have been many studies on the individual countries and different aspects of the refugee crisis in the region. However, I'm happy that ORSAM now provides us with an unprecedented analysis that systematically compares the challenges in the 4 countries most affected by the Syrian crisis. I'm convinced that we can derive many new insights and ideas of how we can tackle these challenges more comprehensively from the study that will be presented today. And I think it has been handed out for those who haven't seen it, it's around there. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to the refugee crisis in the region. Still, by comparing Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq, we can learn how similar challenges can be tackled mutually in a cooperative manner. For example, I would like to understand, about 2 weeks ago I was in Turkey, and what I have learned in Turkey was that overall, with all the obstacles, the refugee crisis has a positive effect on the Turkish economy. In Lebanon, I'm always told that similar events, if we look at it, of course there's a positive impact, there's this, there's that, but overall it's a negative impact. So that's interesting that we have these 2 total differences. Would be interesting to understand why, what is done differently. I'm looking forward to the presentation of the study and a fruitful discussion that will yield additional light on the challenges that we face, and hope that today will bring us a step closer to solving these challenges. I'm convinced that only if we work together through dialogue, discussion, and understanding can we develop creative concepts that will benefit all countries affected to the Syrian crisis. I know that sometimes results of research, of thorough research, is not appreciated by everyone. And we have interest groups, we have lobbies, we have politicians who sometimes don't like the results and put pressure on academians of thinking different. Yeah. We also have a representative from a university from Bursa, Uludağ University. Uludağ means the strong mountain. So let's hope that the science and the scientists will always stand there as a strong mountain and resist the pressure on them to change their results. It's not the first time in history. It's in the region, unfortunately, increasing again. Think back of Galilei. At the end he said, despite all the pressure, but it does move. And in that sense, I hope science and the scientists involved in that can stand as a strong mountain, whatever pressure might come on their results. I thank for your attention and wish us an interesting and fruitful workshop.
Thank you. I also, on behalf of ORSAM, would love to thank both partners, Issam Fares Center and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. ORSAM is one of the Turkish think tanks based in Ankara. We are focusing mostly on the foreign policy issues, particularly Middle Eastern issues, trying to understand the developments in the Middle East from a Turkish perspective, but approaching the entire region from a Turkish perspective alone is not sufficient, so we always try to have also a comparative perspective, and in that respect, most of our studies are based on actual field works. And then we have been lucky enough to partner with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, their office in Ankara in Turkey, and some of our studies, field work in the region have been supported by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and also with Issam Fares Center, we have been coordinating in different projects. Right now, our colleagues are helping out Issam Fares studies on refugees and education policies. And we hope that in the future, similar partnerships will continue. As a matter of fact, also last year we had a workshop here in the very same auditorium, and it was very useful for us to understand the dynamics of the Lebanese politics. At ORSAM, we are trying to understand basically the Syrian crisis in its many respects. Refugees is actually one of them, and as a matter of fact, before we published a report on the impact of the Syrian crisis on neighbors in terms of refugees, and we understood that the impact will go deeper. It will not be limited to the issue of refugees. There are other security-related issues. There are patterns of radicalization. There are deep economic impacts. So we wanted to further that study. The original study was here. So this was the impact in terms of refugees. And later we wanted to expand it, and we carried out another study, which you will hear soon, the results. And then after that, actually, we have another ongoing research project. The field work has been completed. It looks at the impact of the Syrian crisis on the minorities, how different minority groups in Syria have adjusted themselves, how they made sense of the crisis, what were their reactions to the crisis. So this will also be published later this year, maybe in the fall. And then we will also embark on another study that looks at the northern front from a military point of view in the Syrian crisis. But other than the Syrian crisis and the refugees, at ORSAM we are carrying out different research projects. We have a program on the Turkmen in the Middle East, especially in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria. We are studying very closely the Turkmen community in those countries. Other than that, recently we have been building another program on foreign terrorist fighters, because in addition to the refugees, this has been another major security concern in the region recently. So we are trying to understand that problem in its international context, and at ORSAM we have some other projects going on. Today here at this particular workshop, actually our objective is twofold. On the one hand, to present the results as we see them, but on the other hand also to receive your feedback. I mean, in previous reports, we printed the report and then presented it, but this time, before printing the final report, we did not think it was useful. So before printing the final report, we wanted to have workshops, present the results, get some feedback from the discussants on the panel as well as audience, so that we can incorporate that feedback into the final report. And we hope that today's event, the active contributions, comments, feedback from the audience will also help us excel the findings of the report, and eventually later this month or in July, we will finalize the report and officially print it and circulate it. Again, I would love to thank to the partner institutions. Also, on behalf of ORSAM, I would love to thank to Turkish Embassy in Beirut. They have been also quite helpful in terms of facilitating our visit and contacts throughout our field work. When we visited Beirut before as part of the field work, they were very helpful. And then lastly, I would love to thank to everybody who took the time in this summer, in this hot weather, to come here and listen to somehow academic and somehow which might appear boring to some presentations, but I hope our speakers are lively enough to stimulate a lot of interest from the audience, and thank you again.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to go straight into the presentations of the report, so we'll ask the speakers of the next session to come up. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today we will introduce our basic findings about the project on the effects of the Syrian crisis on neighboring countries. We focused on the 4 neighboring countries in terms of some basic issues. As we can see, we have one crisis and 4 neighbors, but we have also similar and interrelated effects. I mean the refugee effect or the migration effect. We have the effects on state structure in each country. We have the radicalization effect. We have the social effects and economic effects, and also security-related effects. But in terms of neighboring countries, we have all different outcomes regarding the sui generis nature of the neighboring countries. So I will mostly focus on Lebanon and Iraq, while Oytun will focus on Jordan and Turkey parts. Starting from Iraq, I can say that migration maybe is one of the least important issue for Iraq, because as we can see from the slide, Iraq shoulders the least burden of the Syrian refugees. Now, today, Turkey is the most populous refugee host country in terms of more than or about 3 million when we include the Iraqi refugees before Afghans and the other refugees. We are now hosting about 3 million refugees in the world. In terms of Syrian crisis, as you can see from the slide, nearly 60% of the refugees are hosted by Turkey, while Iraq receives only 5% of the refugees. And also Jordan is hosting about 14%, while Lebanon is hosting 22%. But of course, this shouldn't be considered as Lebanon or Jordan is less affected from the crisis. But when we look at the Iraq issue or Iraqi case, even Iraq hosts 5% or the least percent of the crisis. The huge burden is on the KRG, I mean Kurdistan Regional Government. Nearly 97% of the refugees, Syrians, are now hosted in Kurdistan Regional Government territories. And one of the most important points about the migration effect of the Syrian crisis is that most of the Syrians seeking shelter in Iraq are the Syrian Kurds. Are the Syrian Kurds who are displaced or seeking shelter because not only because of the regime, but also because of the policies of PYD and PKK affiliated groups. So they were somehow deported or expelled to the Kurdistan Regional Government. But beside the refugee issue, I mean, beside the Syrians hosted in Iraq, the real problem maybe for Iraq can be considered as the IDPs, internally displaced persons. Yes, it was a reality. Before the Syrian crisis, there were about 1 million refugees during the Saddam era, and there were also about 1.3 million IDPs after the dissolution of Saddam regime, but with the ISIS attacks, which we considered as a side effect of the Syrian crisis, there were about now in Iraq, there were about more than 3 million IDPs inside Iraq, which will be a real problem in the day after ISIS or in the day after the solution of the Syrian crisis. Regarding the effects on the state structure, we all know that Iraq was not in a very good condition before the Syrian crisis. We all know that there were problems in terms of enabling the public order, and state authority was in question, especially in some parts, especially in Sunni populated areas. Of course, there were some corruption problems which directly affects the economy also, but the ineffectiveness of the government and the Iraqi army can be concluded as the bad governance of the state's management caused a lot of problems. But with the Syrian crisis, there were positive and negative effects to the state structure of Iraq. Just think about the crisis. Before the crisis, there were presidential issue. I mean, Mr. Jalal Talabani was in Germany for medical treatment since 2012. Iraq's presidency was vacant at that time, and there were elections in April 2014, and there were ongoing discussions to form the new government, which Maliki insisted to be the third time time in his prime ministry, while the other factions, groups, including the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the other major Shiite groups were opposing to it. And there were also problems between Kurdistan regional government and Baghdad regarding the oil issue, the disputed territories, and the other issues as well regarding the status of Kirkuk, for instance. And this Syrian crisis, I mean the ISIS and the Syrian crisis, suspended the ongoing issues or the ongoing problems in Iraq somehow. And it enabled to form the government without Maliki. And it enabled to elect a new president, and we can consider as a negative effect, I think, in terms of state structure. There were Hashd al-Shabi founded or created after Sistani's call, Sistani's fatwa, mostly populated by Shias, and in terms of Iraq, there is not a fear of explosion, but a fear of implosion because of the old problems and new challenges. I mean, there were a lot of things waiting for us in the day after the Syrian crisis and the day after ISIS in terms of Iraq. There were, of course, effects of radicalization. I have to summarize in 15 minutes. That's because I will give 7 or 8 minutes to Iraq and 7 and 8 minutes to Lebanon. That's why I'm trying to be more quick. But when you have questions, I think after the all panel, we will take the questions. We have effects on radicalization because of the Syrian crisis, and the radicalized groups can be considered in 3 dimensions. The local Sunnis, which they face or they see the ISIS as a real alternative to the Shia-dominated regime. Since 2003, there were no alternatives to the Baghdad regime or the they called as a Shia-dominated regime, but they, at the first time, they see an alternative to the Shia-dominated regime. That's why the participation to ISIS is a real problem. The radicalization among local Shiites, which I will focus on the security effects, forming of Hashd al-Shabi and other militias. And there were also radicalization tendency among Kurds, which started to think its survival regarding the strengthening of Shia power or the ISIS issue. Also, we have social effects which really directly linked to the IDP issue. It's the displacement policies. The perpetrators can be ISIS, Daesh, I mean Iraqi army, the Shia militias, Peshmerga, or other armed groups. And the victims can be considered as the Sunnis, Shiites, Turkmens, Yazidis, and Kurds. I mean, all Iraqis are the victims, and perpetrators can change due to the instances. But all Iraqi people are directly affected because of this displacement policies. Even they liberated the areas. I mean, even they liberated a territory from ISIS, there were still ongoing displacement and redisplacement policies to change the demographic structure, to change the demographic borders of the country. And also regarding Iraq, there were effects on economy. And when we compare the effects of the Syrian crisis on Iraq with the economy, Iraqi economy or economic effects, the short-term effects are not, cannot be considered as so dramatic, but the major indirect effect of the Syrian crisis is the interruption of existing investments. Of course, it's also related to ISIS expansion or ISIS holding the territory, and I think KRG is more vulnerable to the economic effects because of not allocating the budgets from the Baghdad government to Erbil administration. And there were effects on Iraqi security, which we can say that Iraq developed 2 short-term responses for the challenge or to manage the challenge to its security. The first one is, which I mentioned earlier, is the formation of Hashd al-Shabi, but the second one is the asking for military support from the other countries. And for the second response, we can consider it in 4 headlines, which one is the short-term light arms and ammunition aid and plus training with Germany, Turkey, and several countries, more than 12 countries contributed. The basic and improved arms sales, which the United States, Russia, and somehow Iran, despite the sanctions, contributed. The weapons and active field operative support, which can be considered solely by Iran. I mean, everyone knows the Qasem Soleimani, what he is doing in Iran now, in Iraq now, and of course the air support of the coalition. Without the air support of coalition, Iraq cannot resist to the ISIS attacks. Let me quote one of the high-level official in Iraq. He says that without coalition's air support, for instance, Kirkuk cannot resist to Daesh attacks in one day. Cannot resist for one day to the Daesh attacks. So the coalition air support is really important, and also the Iranian influence, the growing Iranian influence will bear some negative or positive consequences for the future of Iraq. And there are 2 possible risks regarding Iraq. The first one is the future of Hashd al-Shabi, which has more fighting capability than the Iraqi army. After the removal of ISIS threat, what will we do with the Hashd al-Shabi? Will it become a regular force? Will it become or transform to a national guard? What will we do with the Hashd al-Shabi? It's a real challenge for the future of Iraq. And the other one is the re-emergence of the pre-crisis tensions between Baghdad and Erbil. Because we will see a more strong, in military terms, Baghdad after the crisis, and more experienced KRG Peshmergas after the crisis. So what will we do about the ongoing tensions or the pre-crisis tensions? What will the status of Kirkuk be? Will Peshmerga withdraw from Kirkuk? Will Hashd al-Shabi let them to stay in Kirkuk? There are a lot of questions to be answered, and these can be the risks or the challenge which Iraq will face in the near future. So let me focus on Lebanon now. We have we have the same effects in Lebanon, but we have also the different outcomes. The previous experiences of Lebanon determined, or is the basic factor to determine the refugee response to the Syrian crisis. Even I'm saying that Lebanon is only hosting 22% of the refugees. When you consider it with the population ratio, we can say that Lebanon is one of the most populous refugee hosting countries in terms of ratio in the world now. So the refugee burden Lebanon shoulders means 18 million refugees in Turkey, 8 million Syrians in Iraq, or 75 million Syrians in the United States. So even the number is less when you compare it with Turkey. The shoulder Lebanon, the burden Lebanon is shouldering is really important. And regarding the effects of the Syrian crisis on state structure of Lebanon, we can say that, like Iraq, the ongoing problems also contribute to the effects on the state structure, and the approach of Lebanese political actors towards the crisis dismantled the state structure in Lebanon. When the crisis was ongoing, the caretaker government, there was a caretaker government in Lebanon from May 2013 till 2014. As we all know, the parliamentary elections were postponed till 2017, and Lebanon now elects a president. The president office is vacant due to the developments about the Syrian crisis. And of course, there is no need to mention the malfunction of basic services, including the other things. Regarding the effects on state structure, we should not forget the Baghdad Declaration, which is, I think, really important, but especially one actor, which you all know, that Hezbollah is now involved in the Syrian crisis, and of course it will have negative repercussions in terms of state structure and as well as the other dimensions in Lebanon, in our opinion. There were effects on radicalization in Lebanon, which radicalization effect can be seen among four main groups: the Lebanese Shia, the Lebanese Sunnis, the Lebanese Nusayris. Even their number is low when you consider it, when you compare with the Sunnis and the Shias. It's about 100,000, and they are mostly populated in the northern part of the country. And the potential radicalization is for Syrians seeking shelter in Lebanon. Only 10% of radicalized Syrians can be a really big problem for Lebanese politics. But before it, I think the Shia radicalization and the Sunni radicalization is one of the important aspects which should be studied on it because of their involvement. I mean the Hezbollah's involvement and also the Sunni participation to the opposition groups. Not only opposition groups, I mean not only moderate opposition, but also to the radicalized Salafist movements, ISIS, Daesh, and Al-Nusra. The social effects of the crisis on Lebanon also can be evaluated in three dimensions, or in the report we evaluated it in three dimensions. Effects of or effects to the Syrians living in Lebanon, the local reactions towards dominant political factions' engagement to the crisis. I mean especially Hezbollah's engagement to the crisis, and other attitudes of other Lebanese ethnic or religious groups, which has started to engage in both with the other parties and somehow trying to pursue a wait-and-see policy or like that. The economic effects of the Syrian crisis in Lebanon, there are two arguments. As Dr. Peter told. One side claims the negative economic effects by using macro data. It costs about $7.5 billion. We all know the numbers. While the others admit the negative effects, but believe it has also positively effects on Lebanese economy. We should not forget, when we consider the refugee burden in Lebanon, we should not forget the Syrians already residing or working in Lebanon before the crisis. There were about 300 to 500,000 Syrians working in Lebanon. Before the crisis, they were they get used to send their earnings to Syria, to their families, but with the crisis, they mostly bring their families to Lebanon, and now they are spending their earnings in Lebanon. So there are negative and positive effects of the crisis in terms of Lebanon. And of course there were effects on security. We evaluated the security effects in three main dimensions. One is direct dimension, which is directly related to the Lebanese army and domestic security. The crisis in Syria has underscored the need for a strong Lebanese army. I mean, the seek for trust to the army increased with the crisis. And of course, there were positive and negative consequences of Hezbollah's role in Syria. And indirectly, there is the risk of strengthening of radical actors inside Lebanon when we consider the Ersal issue, for instance, or other potential places. These are all directly effects, can be considered as the effects on Lebanese security because of the Syrian crisis. Now I will stop here and give the floor to Oytun to focus on the Syrian crisis effects on Turkey and Jordan. I think you will start with Turkey, right?
Yes, right.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Before starting, I would also like to thank Konrad Adenauer Syria Iraq office and also AUB Issam Fares Institute as a partner to ORSAM who facilitated our event in Beirut. And besides, I would also like to thank the Turkish embassy in Beirut because this research, which you are already hearing the findings, is based on field research that has been done in Iraq, in Turkish borders, in Jordan, and also in Lebanon. So in our Lebanon field research, the embassy was so much helpful to facilitate our...
So let me interrupt. I totally agree with Oytun, and especially thanks to His Excellency for his dreadful support and to all organizing partners.
Yes, thank you very much. And also this project was also supported by the Konrad Adenauer Turkey office, so I think we also should thank to them. So let me start with giving some figures about the refugees, the Syrians in Turkey. The topics are the same. I would like to continue where the Dr. Ferhat finished, the same topics. So the migration effects, when we look at the key figures about the Syrians in Turkey, you can easily see that at the beginning of the Syrian crisis, actually the numbers were so less, and the main assumption of the Turkish authorities and the Turkish society was like that. I mean, the Syrians are going to come to Turkey, will reside in Turkey in a very short time, and then when the Syrian crisis will end, they will return to their country, and the number will not be so much high. So the main perception towards the Syrians among the Turkish society and the policy of the Turkish government towards the Syrian refugees were based on that assumption. But as you can see, especially after 2013, the number increased critically. And it is, of course, based on the intensifying clashes on the northern front, especially in Aleppo, in Idlib, and also the rise of ISIS and PYD. You can see that there is a critical increase in the numbers between 2013 and 2014. So it was nearly 200,000 in 2014, and just 1 year after, it is nearly 1.5 million Syrians in Turkey. So when we look at the actual number of the Syrians in Turkey, it is the registered ones by the Afterthe, who is responsible for the Syrians in Turkey. It is 2.7. This is the actual number. Of course, this is the official number who are registered, but besides that, everybody knows that there are Syrians who are not already registered. So in total, it is considered there are 3 million Syrians in Turkey. And with that number, Turkey is the biggest country, I mean, who hosts refugees in the world. But of course, when we compare it with the percentage, Jordan and Lebanon, I should say, is the most burden is on those countries. And like all other neighboring countries, the Syrians are mostly living in urban areas. The first figure on the left side is showing the Syrians living in the camps and temporary protection centers, as we call in Turkey, and the ones living in the urban areas. 260,000 Syrians, and that makes nearly 9% of the Syrians are living in those centers, and nearly 91% of the Syrians are living in the urban areas. And this is actually the biggest problem, or the main reason which created some social or security effects in Turkish society, which I will mention in the meantime. So in total, as I said, officially it is 2.7 million. And these are the cities who host Syrians. The 10 city who host Syrians mostly. The majority are the border cities. Shalni Urfa is the biggest one, is the first one, and Istanbul. There are some big cities in Turkey, but other than that, the border cities are holding the burden mostly, I should say. But there is no city in Turkey, there is 81 cities in Turkey, there is no city in Turkey that is not receiving or hosting Syrians in their city. The number could be low, but still, I mean, there is no city, because at the beginning, as I said, the assumption was that they are going to stay and will return in the meantime, but as they realized, the government realized that the Syrians will stay in Turkey and the Syrian conflict will not end in the midterm, they as a second phase, the government started to distribute the Syrians rather than the border cities to the other cities of the Turkish territory. So this is a result of that. So on that basis, there are Syrians in all Turkish cities now. When we look at the effects on the state structure, I can say that compared with the other neighboring countries, thanks to the political stability and the state mechanism efficiency, I could say that the negative effects on the state structure is somehow less comparing with the other neighboring countries. At the beginning, it was a crisis. There was a turbulence at the beginning. Nobody was ready for such a Syrian refugee influx, but in the meantime, I should say that the Turkish government institutions and also civil society organizations adapted themselves to the new reality, and that also created an opportunity for the Turkish government institutions and the civil society organization to enhance their organizational capacity. In that sense, I think the Afterthe, who is dealing with the Syrians, should be mentioned. It has become the primary organization or institutions in the world in dealing with natural disasters. So, and also the temporary protection centers, the camps should also be mentioned. These camps are really high standard camps, and these are not only considered as camps, but also areas which could be used in some national disaster issues. Some new institutions were also formed like Director General for Migration Management. When we look at the effects on radicalization, this effect could be seen in Turkish society within 4 segments or ideological groups in Turkish society. First one is the radical Salafi jihadists. These were not so much powerful even now within Turkey. There used to be some Al-Qaeda cells within Turkey, but with regards to social base and also organizational capacity, they were not so much powerful. But after the Syrian crisis and the radicalization in Syria, I should say that those people or segments of the Turkish society are also affected by the radicalization in Syria. So we see that the radical jihadists in Turkey are much more visible. There are still, when we compare with the population, it is still low, but there are lots of people who are joining alongside with the ISIS or other radical groups inside Syria. The Nusayris are living in Hatay, in the border city, and also in Adana. There are also some people, although it is limited, there are some people among those people who are also fighting in Syria alongside with the Syrian regime. The Kurdish nationalists and PKK among those society this radicalization could be seen, that is also very visible, and we are already seeing the clashes between the Turkish security forces and the PKK, and the Kurdish youngsters, Kurdish nationalists are one of the main elements of that fightings between the Turkish government and that and the PKK, and this is also for sure affected by the fighting in the northern Syria, because the YPG or PYD in northern Syria is a branch of PKK, and the main element of PYD and YPG is the Turkish fighters. Nearly 50% of them are Turkish citizens, and also radical leftists. Still, there are lots of radical leftists within Turkish people who are fighting alongside with the Assad regime inside Syria. This has also effects in Turkey. On concrete means, we had experienced some terrorist attacks from leftist groups, which is a result of the Syrian crisis, as they get some experience from the Syrian civil war. When we look at the social effects, this is totally related with the Syrian refugees, and this high number is somehow a social integration problem. So because of the different language, culture, and lifestyle, there is somehow a local reaction, but it could be defined as a resentment, not a huge reaction, but a resentment towards the Syrians. But there are some accidents in some border cities. The conditions of Syrians also poses a threat in the long run, because they are living in a very hard situation. So in the long run, it is thought that this environment could produce some instability in the long run. And the change in demographic structure, especially in some border cities like Hatay, in Kilis, there is a concern that the demographic structure might change, because, for example, in Kilis, it is nearly 100,000 people living, but they are hosting more than 100,000 Syrians. So they feel themselves minority in their own cities. This causes also some concerns in their own cities, and there is also pressure over the basic services. With regards to the effect on economy, as Mr. Peter mentioned, there is positive effects, but also the negative effects. We cannot calculate the overall result, but the positive effects, there is contribution to the production. The Syrians are already started to produce in Turkish economy. There used to be a gap in the Syrian in the workforce in Turkish economy. They are fulfilling that gap, the Syrians. They are gaining and spending, so this also contributes to Turkish economy. There are lots of Syrian investment and entrepreneurs, mainly in Gaziantep and Mersin. This also contributes. And thanks to their network in the Middle East and Far East, they also contribute to the Turkish export. And in the long run, the Turkish companies, especially in the border area, expecting that they are going to contribute in the reconstruction of Syria. So the war will end, so they will take the leadership of that process. So in the long run, that could be also a positive effect. As a negative effect, unemployment, we see a rise in the unemployment rates in Turkey. It is considered, there is not a reliable work on that, but it is considered that it is related with the Syrians in Turkey. The trade with Syria, it was $2 billion before the crisis. There was a turbulence. It decreased to $300 million. Now it is the same $2 billion like before the crisis, but we don't know what it could be if there was no crisis. I mean, you know that there was a free trade agreement with Syria, so if there was no instability in Syria, probably the numbers, the figures could be higher than that. So in that sense, there is a negative effect on the trade. And it is not related with Syria. Syria is our opening gate to Middle East and Far East, so the transportation costs and also our trade with the Middle East is also affected negatively. And as a social effect related with economy, there is a local reaction because of people are complaining that that they are losing their jobs. The most negative effects is felt on the security side in Turkey. At the beginning, it was the equation in Syria was so much simple, but in the meantime, the actors diversified. Now we have YPG, ISIS, and also foreign terrorist fighters issues. So in that regard, Turkey's priorities in Syria had transformed, and as YPG, thanks to US support in the Northern Front and establishing a so-called federation in Northern Front, deepens Turkish concerns. It has direct effects with its fighting against PKK, and in the long run, it was also creating deep concerns among Turkish state apparatus that Turkey might threaten its political and territorial unity. And the growth of radicalism in Syria, ISIS threat, and the foreign terrorist fighters is another issue which could be mentioned. And related with that, the border security, because the main territory that the foreign terrorist fighters are using is the Turkey's border, and Turkey is doing its best to prevent that, but still those people are using Turkish territory. So we already experienced lots of terrorist attacks in our border cities and also big cities resulting from that issue. Coming to Jordan, like Lebanon, the previous experiences of migration issue in Jordan also affects Jordanian approach towards the refugees. Like Lebanon, the integration of the Syrians is considered as a taboo. In Jordan, they think that somehow in the meantime those Syrians should return their countries. When we look at some figures, now there is officially, according to UNHCR, 600,000 nearly Syrians are living, but the actual number in our field research, when we talked with the Jordanian officials, they were saying 1.3 million Syrians are living. This is related with, like in Lebanon, there are lots of Jordanians who were Syrians who were already working in Syria, so after the crisis they cannot return, so the Jordanians say that it is 1.3 million. Like in all neighboring countries, most of them are living in the urban areas, and the Jordanians are mostly complaining about the insufficient international aid towards the Syrians, although they are receiving the most compared with the other neighboring countries. When we look at the political effects, not only the Syria crisis, but the Arab Spring somehow triggered had an effect on a trigger effect on the political developments in Jordan, and there was a lively debate after the Syrian crisis among the Syrian opposition, Jordanian opposition groups, which seeks for reform, democratic steps, but as the uprising in Syria intensified and has turned into a civil war, the polarization among the Jordanian social segments intensified, and they took positions, so this also isn't the cooperation between those political groups. So the current status of this Syrian civil war, I should say, increased the legitimacy of the Jordanian political system. With regards to radicalization, in Jordan, it could be seen among the radical Salafi jihadists within Nusra and ISIS. The highest ranks are shared by the Jordanians, and in recent times, in the northern side of Jordan, there are clashes with the Jordanian security and the ISIS cells. This is a threat. There is a radicalization effect. With regards to social effects, this is somehow the same with the Jordan and Turkey and Lebanon case. Health services, education, there is pressure over on that, so there is somehow local reaction on that. Effects on economy, like the other cases, there are negative effects and the positive effects. The border trade has decreased. The Jordanian says that there are calculable costs, but we should consider the incalculable and indirect costs. There's a water problem. It's a water poor country. there is an unemployment. This is also related with the Syrians. It is considered with the Syrians. I mean, like the same, like in Turkey, the positive effects are the same, and effects on the security, it is also related with the rise of radicalization. As I said, lots of fighters among ISIS and Nusra Front are Jordanian origin, so this poses a huge threat to Jordanian security. Besides that, the disintegration of Syria is concerning the Jordanians, because they think that if Jordan disintegrates, one region could be controlled by radical Islamists, so this could also threaten Jordanian regime security. So this is all I should say. Maybe we can go on further in Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your patience. I think, Ryan, we will have a coffee break. Maybe... We will receive questions, huh?
So we're running a little late, but it's okay. I think for a half-day event, we'll have enough time to get feedback and questions. We'll take maybe 3 at a time and then bring it back to the speakers. And we'll start with the ambassador, if you want to go ahead. But please wait for the mic before you speak so that the recording can pick up.
Thank you very much. I don't have a question, but I've got to go. I have an appointment with one of the ministers, so I have to leave you. I apologize for that. But before leaving, I'd like to thank you for ORSAM, for your institutions and the Conrad, and for this very good partnership. So I read the report yesterday, and I believe it will be a very useful input for the policymakers in our region. I will definitely benefit from this report, and I'd like to thank you, Issam Fares, for having us, ORSAM, for organizing this event. And I just want to mention that keep up the good work. And just to remind the journalists and other press members of Lebanon that there will be a press briefing in the afternoon in the Turkish Cultural Center at 5 o'clock. Those who miss today's event, morning's event, can join us at 5 o'clock in the Turkish Cultural Center. Thank you very much.
I want to thank the ambassador and the Turkish embassy. Thank you very much. We'll go ahead and take comments and questions. Faddal.
Well, my name is Adil Korta, former Minister of Agriculture in Lebanon. We are very grateful, and we thank IssamFares Institute for giving us this opportunity to discuss a very important problem in our countries of the Middle East. I listened very carefully to what you have said, but there is one aspect you have not considered, that besides the negative aspects we have seen in this influx of Syrian refugees into our countries, we don't have to forget that some of these Syrians are very wealthy and they are investing in our country. And I know in my area of Ashrafi and in Sindelfield, they are buying apartments, etc., etc. And I heard yesterday on the TV that even in Turkey, about 5,000 companies, Syrian companies, were established in Turkey, and they are contributing very carefully to the. We don't have to forget, Mr. Chairman, that in my country, in Lebanon, some aspects of the economy, like buildings, construction, agriculture, gasoline station, the Lebanese would not work at all in all these things, you know. Therefore, we have to thank and appreciate the contribution made by the Syrian refugees in this area. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take 2 more questions. Gentleman in the back there. Yes, yes.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. You talked about the impact on the neighboring countries. My name is Laura Alauddin from Mary. You mentioned how much this impacted on Iraq and Lebanon and their government. I would have liked you to have commented on Turkey and how much the crisis, whether ISIL or whether Lebanon, impacted on Turkish government policy. Because as we can see, Turkish standing in the international community has been tarnished. Turkey's policies towards Syria over the last 5 years went through changes and reactions, but also radicalization. How about state radicalization, as well as, because you mentioned Salafist, Kurdish nationalist, leftist groups and so on and so forth, but the state itself reacted in many ways that might have been derailed at times. So I would have liked to have seen in your report some of the impact on the government policies and the same effects on the government as a whole.
Yes, gentleman behind you, and then we'll bring it back to the speakers.
My name is George Fahmi. I'm a researcher at the Carnegie Middle East Institute. Oytun, thank you very much for the interesting report. I'm interested in when you spoke about radicalization, because I think Turkey is a good example that shows that radicalization is not only Islamic, it could be also nationalist or ideological. So I'm interested in the case of radical leftists who are fighting with the regime, as you mentioned. If you could say more, like a few more words about them, what are their motivation, where do they come from? I think that would be interesting.
Okay, thank you. Most of the questions stems from the lack of time issue. In the reports, regarding His Excellency Minister's question, in the report we also mentioned about Syrians' investments in neighboring countries, especially in Lebanon, in Turkey, and in Jordan also. So we already mentioned and deal with these issues in the report. Regarding the Professor de la Ver's questions, I think we did, right? Yes. The state reaction to the security-related issues, we already mentioned it, but because of the lack of time, we have to be quick and summarize and give only the headlines. I think after having the feedbacks and with today's discussions, we will publish it as soon as possible, I think.
Yes, I mean, it is totally related with the time limitation. I mean, you mentioned about the Syrian investment and entrepreneurs, which I already mentioned in my presentation, but if you could have chance to see the full report, you could see the figures, actually how the Syrian investment and the Syrian entrepreneurs has critically risen in Turkey. I mean, we gave that figures city by city. For example, Kilis, Gaziantep, Mersin is a very important examples, and nearly tripled the numbers, nearly tripled in those cities, the Syrian entrepreneurs. So there is a positive effect on that side. You can see the figures. With regards to Turkish government policy, how it evolved in the meantime, of course, I mean, it affected, the priorities had changed. The Assad regime, the anti-Assad position is still there, but on the other hand, the concentration is turning towards the northern front, I should say, because of the rise of ISIS and YPG. As I said, I mean, this does not affect Turkey's general approach towards the Syrian crisis, but they should deal, the government feels herself to deal with that new security threats on the northern front. For example, with regards to ISIS, we experienced the biggest terrorist attacks in Turkey, Turkish history, in Ankara, in border cities. So in that sense, there is a rising concern among the Turkish security apparatus. Still the YPG, I should say, the priority as a branch of PKK, but ISIS has become one of the main threats to Turkish security. And on daily basis, you know, from ISIS-controlled areas, the border cities, mainly Kilis, is shelled by ISIS. So Turkey is trying to prevent that attacks from ISIS and also proposing a security zone in coordination with US to establish a security zone in that area to take responsibility in those areas. So the government policy is transforming, I should say. Regarding the radical leftists, I mean, those radical leftists used to be somehow influential in 1970s and 1980s, but their influence reduced. But the Syrian crisis had a trigger effect that we saw those groups much more visible in Turkey. It is also, of course, related with the Syria crisis because of Turkey's position towards the Syrian crisis. The leftists somehow showed their reaction towards the Turkish state, which I mean not the leftists, but radical leftists and terrorist organizations showed their reaction via those fighting in Syria. So they, as a secular movement, they fight alongside with the Syrian regime inside Syria. They got experience. They got support from the Syrian regime, from the Syrian intelligence. So in that regard, now they are much more visible. They are fighting in Kurdish areas with YPG, some radical leftist groups. Some people, lots of Turkish leftists are going to Syria, fighting there, getting experience, returning back to Turkey, and we already experienced lots of terrorist attacks within Turkey, which we couldn't see before the Syrian crisis. So this is their main motivation, being against Turkish state, I should say.
Okay. Right over here, and then in the back after that.
Thank you very much for this very clear presentation. I'm Dr. Jana Jabouri, professor at the University of St. Joseph. Oytun, you're a big expert of Turkmens. So to what extent did the Syrian crisis affect the stance of Turkmens, both in Syria and Iraq? And to what extent can we see an evolution in their position vis-à-vis Turkey? Because to my knowledge, before the Syrian crisis, they were relatively neutral vis-à-vis the Turkish government, while we might be seeing a sort of rapprochement currently. And we see this formation of a new official institution in Turkey dealing with the Turks abroad. So to what extent we can see an evolution in Turkmen's position?
I mean, Turkmen's was all...
Three questions.
Okay,
Go ahead and take two more. There's two in the back, and I think we should use the other microphone. This one seems to be giving some feedback. So there's two. One there, and then one back there.
Thank you for the presentation. My question involves Shias and radicalization, which seems to have become a very loose term. But how does your data arrive at the conclusion that because Hezbollah is involved in Syria, then there is radicalization among Shias in Lebanon? Because I don't really see evidence of that. I think there's a difference between radicalization and intensified sectarian political opinions. Thank you.
Just the gentleman in the back there, please. And let's keep our comments to 1 minute so that we can get enough time to get feedback.
Thomas Schellen, Executive Magazine. You were tasking 4 countries in responses, and 1 north, 1 south, 1 east, and 1 west. How is the carry-on effect into other countries further afield, in your opinion? How much impact will the Syrian crisis with time have on countries further north and further east, especially, and also as far as Turkey, the relationship to Europe? Thank you.
I will take the Hezbollah question first, I think. What I mean about the radicalization effect of the Syrian crisis on Lebanon, for instance, Hezbollah's involvement in Syrian crisis, despite the Baghdad aggression, have 2 effects. One, the funerals coming from Syria gives a tendency for radicalization among the newly recruited Hezbollah members. And the second one is the others' reactions, especially the Sunni
Lebanese reactions towards Hezbollah's involvement. That's why I called it the radicalization tendency. Actually, it was somehow tendency, not the exact radicalization, not the fighting only. It's a tendency, and in our fieldwork, we saw in three groups, among three groups, we directly saw it. And regarding the Northeast effects, I think European Union effects. Turkish-European Union impact on Turkish-European Union relations.
Relations.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
maybe you can summarize.
Yes, I mean it is totally related with the refugee influx towards the European countries. This created somehow a base for cooperation between mainly Germany and Turkey on the basis of the Syrian refugees, because the Europeans were like considering the Syrian problem and the refugee issue as a regional problem, a Middle Eastern problem, but after the tendency towards the European territory, it is considered as a common problem. So on the basis of that, there is now a cooperation between Turkey and the European Union. But still, rather than humanitarian side, the Europeans are looking the issue as a political issue or security-related issue. So on that sense, I think there are still some problems between Turkey and European side. The Europe is trying to give just financial support to the Syrians in Turkey, but rather than that, there is not so much comprehensive cooperation between these two. And other issue is the foreign terrorist fighters. After the terrorist attacks in European capitals, also this issue enabled or pushed the European countries to cooperate with the Turkish side, because Turkey was always saying that there should be a intelligence cooperation to solve that foreign terrorist fighters issue, because it is not all about the passing of the FTPs from Turkish territory to the Syria, but it should be prevented in the origin countries. So the origin countries should share their intelligence with Turkey, and thanks to that increasing cooperation, now we have a nearly 40,000 people listed possible foreign terrorist fighters. If they are arrested in the border area or in the airports, they are resent to their origin country. So these two issues are the main issues which created somehow a limited cooperation between Turkey and European countries. And the Turkoman issue. Turkoman issue, not only Turkomans, but also related communities. We have an institution in Turkey, I mean Turks, and also related communities presidency. So it's not only ethnic Turks, but also the Kurds or Circassians or whatever it is. All related communities within Turkey are somehow an element of Turkish foreign policy. Turkomans are also, as a part of that, in Syrian crisis was one of the main elements of Turkish foreign policy. But I should say at the beginning, the main attention was towards the Arab opposition. The main concentration was on Damascus. But as the control in Syria as the control is out of control, in the situation in Syria is out of control, Turkey also turned its attention towards the northern front. And the Turkomans, although they are not, the numbers are not so high, they are settled in very strategical issues on the exit of Mediterranean and also on Turkish border area. So in that sense, their importance increased. As a part of Syrian opposition, Turkey is supporting the Syrian Turkmens, and they are settled in a very crucial area between Azaz and Cerablus area, which Turkey is trying to establish a security zone. So in that sense, Turkey is increasing its support to those groups. But as I said, it is a part of Turkish support to the Syrian opposition, not limited with the Syrian Turkomans.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're going to do one more round of hands and then we'll close it off for the coffee break. So one more round. Questions, comments? If not, we'll take one more there in the back and I think we'll wrap it up and we'll have the coffee break.
Yes, hello, thank you. After the closure of the Balkan route, there was an EU deal with Turkey so that Syrian refugees and other refugees are returned to Turkey. But there were objections about declaring Turkey as a safe third country because it is said that the Turkish government has returned Syrian refugees back to Syria. And I would like to know your opinion about that. Thank you.
And we'll take one more question from Mr. Peter Rimmel in the front over here, and we'll then go back to the speakers to wrap it up.
Thank you. One to the figures, just to clarify, you used the official registration figures to compare, like Lebanon 1,055,000. It's the same like you mentioned for Turkey. There are also a few 100,000 what are not registered.
These are
so that might also have to be
UNHCR's official figures.
Okay, just to clarify. Then for Iraq, you said of Iraqi reactions or Iraqi, let me say, considerations. Geographically and on the map, it's still one Iraq. In fact, it's not, because Kurdistan is behaving different. Did you distinguish within the study, or you treat it as one?
Okay, thank you. Regarding the Turkey's consideration as a not safe country, it's really comic. It's an ironic issue. You know, there were about only about 3 million Syrians in Turkey, not to mention the other Iraqis, Afghans, and the burden of most of the Syrians, I mean 90%, more than 90% of the burden of the refugees are directly spent by the Turkish government. And on the other hand, the conditions of the Syrians, I have been in Jordan, I have been in Iraq, I have been in Lebanon, I mean during the study on the effects of the Syrian refugees in neighboring countries. So I have been in Turkey also. I am living in Turkey. I saw the camps. I always visit all the Syrians in not only in the neighboring countries but also in my hometown. There are about 100,000 Syrians. So the conditions of the Syrians are we can consider as the best in terms of seeking shelter. Is the best, especially is the best in the camps. I mean, in the camps, in the Afterthe managed camps, and also it's well designed in the cities. So it's an ironic issue. I think it's a political consideration, only a political consideration. It's somehow an Orientalistic view, I think. And regarding the impacts on Iraq, yes, we differentiated the impacts on KRG and impacts on Baghdad, but especially in, I think, economic terms, on the refugee burden terms, and on the security issues, we diversified the KRG reaction and the Baghdad government's reactions.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up. Maybe you want to hold it for the next session. We will have a break until 11:15, and then we'll come back. Thank you.